Power cannot heal what the mind refuses to confront. An emperor once ruled the known world, yet could not command his own thoughts. That is the paradox at the heart of Stoicism. We imagine authority as protection. We assume status grants stability. But what happens when external control fails to quiet internal chaos? Before we continue, you are gently invited to subscribe, leave a like, and share a comment. This channel is a small space for grounding and reflection, created for those who seek a calmer way of understanding themselves and the world. If you feel comfortable, tell us where you are and what time it is for you. Your presence here matters, and your words help weave a quiet community across the distance. May what follows bring you ease, clarity, and a softer place to rest your thoughts. Long before modern psychology mapped cognition and emotion, Marcus Aurelius was already documenting the architecture of the mind. When the Roman Empire faced plague, war, and instability, turned inward, not to escape, to discipline perception. Stoicism was never cold detachment. It was the art of remaining lucid in crisis. The central question is unavoidable. How does a human being remain steady when everything shifts? In 2025, our world moves faster than any empire ever did. Information overwhelms. Expectations multiply. Yet anxiety persists. Progress has not eliminated disturbance. It has refined it. Stoic philosophy does not promise comfort. It demands clarity. It does not suppress emotion. It interrogates it. The problem is not the event. It is the judgment we attach to it. This is not theory for debate. It is a manual for inner sovereignty. And to understand it, we must begin with the first foundation Marcus lays before us: the difference between what happens and how we choose to see it. The world does not wound us by itself. The wound opens in the space where our judgments distort what actually happens. This is the first and most brutal truth Marcus Aurelius forces us to face. A man who ruled an empire, commanded armies, and carried the weight of millions still found his greatest battles unfolding inside his own skull. Power could not shield him from anxiety. Authority could not silence his doubts. Being emperor offered him no immunity from the chaos of interpretation. And his honesty in confronting this reveals the paradox at the heart of human suffering. External forces shake us far less than the internal stories we attach to them. Before modern psychology described cognitive filters and distorted thinking patterns, Marcus had already diagnosed the mind as a restless commentator, generating meaning from every event, weaving judgments into every sensation, and transforming neutral facts into emotional storms. He saw clearly that the mind is not a passive lens, but an active engine, one that invents narratives at a ferocious pace, often without our awareness. We do not experience raw reality. We experience our commentary on reality. And that commentary can elevate or destroy us. Stoicism begins here, not with hardness, not with suppression, but with the revelation that interpretation is the birthplace of suffering. The world unfolds, the mind reacts, and between these two movements lies the narrow space in which freedom can exist. That space is where our agency is born. Marcus insists that events themselves are not the cause of our torment. Loss, change, insult, uncertainty. None of these contain suffering inherently. They acquire weight only when filtered through judgments that inflate, distort, personalize. The Stoics knew that the enemy is not pain, but panic. Not challenge, but interpretation. Not the world, but the story we attach to it. A single thought can turn a temporary setback into catastrophe. A single interpretation can convert an inconvenience into humiliation. A single judgment can turn a moment of difficulty into a lifelong wound. The mind, left unchecked, becomes tyrant. It exaggerates threats, amplifies anxieties, imagines future disasters, resurrects old failures. It rehearses fear as if practicing for disaster. Marcus faced this with no illusions. He knew that his own mind, if untrained, could be more dangerous than any invading army. The front line was internal. Modern psychology echoes this truth. Cognitive science reveals that perception is not passive, but constructed. Experiences are shaped by expectation, belief, memory. The brain interprets before it understands. It reacts before it reflects. We suffer not because the world is unbearable, but because the mind convinces us that it is. In this sense, Marcus's reflections were not lofty meditations of an emperor detached from ordinary life. They were precise psychological observations made by a man constantly tested by pressure, responsibility, and loss. He wrote not to impress, but to survive. To understand the architecture of judgment is to understand the architecture of freedom. The mind produces interpretations automatically, but awareness interrupts this automation. Awareness creates distance, and in that distance, the possibility of choice appears. Instead of reacting blindly, we can examine. Instead of drowning in emotion, we can pause. Instead of assuming catastrophe, we can question the narrative. Stoicism is not emotional numbness. It is emotional clarity. It is the discipline of separating what happens from what we tell ourselves about what happens. The Stoic does not escape the world. He interprets it consciously. He refuses to be a slave to his first reaction. That refusal is an act of rebellion against the chaotic machinery of thought. Marcus understood that judgment is habit. People do not become anxious by fate. They become anxious by repetition. They practice panic. They rehearse despair. The mind learns patterns like muscle memory. Stoicism teaches the opposite pattern: detachment, reflection, reframing. These practices change the mental reflex. Over time, mind begins to quiet itself. Thoughts lose their tyranny. Emotion becomes information, not command. Yet self-mastery is not instant. It requires vigilance. Marcus wrote daily because judgment distorts daily. The world continues to provoke. People continue to disappoint. Plans continue to collapse. The mind continues to generate commentary. Stoicism is the ongoing discipline of sorting fact from interpretation, allowing reality to remain reality, and refusing to contaminate it with unnecessary suffering. Imagine a man insulted. The event is simple, words spoken. But judgment rushes in. He disrespected me. I am humiliated. This always happens. People never appreciate me. The pain grows not from the words, but from the story. Or imagine a loss, a missed opportunity, a failed plan. Judgment inflates it into identity. I am incapable. Fate always turns against me. Everything will fall apart. These narratives are not truths. They are interpretations. And Marcus teaches that interpretation can be dismantled. He writes that the mind has the power to strip events of their emotional clothing, to say simply, this happened, not this is tragedy, not this is injustice, not this is evidence that life is against me. Only this happened. From this simplicity comes strength, because the mind stops manufacturing injury. But Stoicism does not ask us to suppress feeling. It demands we interrogate feeling to see whether it emerges from reality or interpretation. Anger often comes not from what was done, but from what we expected. Fear comes not from the present moment, but from imagined futures. Sadness often arises from longing for a past that never truly existed. Marcus knows that by separating event from interpretation, we reclaim agency. This discipline becomes the foundation of psychological freedom. Freedom is not controlling the world. It is controlling our engagement with the world. The universe acts without consulting us. People behave according to their nature, not ours. Weather changes. Plans fail. Bodies age. Chaos emerges without permission. But judgment is ours. Reaction is ours. Meaning is ours. Marcus saw this with startling clarity during plague, war, betrayal, and political turmoil. His empire could be shaken. His loved ones could be taken. His health could deteriorate. But his mind, trained and observed, could remain sovereign. He built an inner architecture sturdier than any palace. This architecture was made not of marble, but of interpretation. The mind's commentary creates the emotional atmosphere in which we live. Change the commentary, and the atmosphere shifts. A man can live in luxury and feel impoverished because his judgment distorts abundance. Another can live in hardship and feel grounded because his judgment interprets struggle as necessary, natural, or even meaningful. Marcus knew what modern research confirms. Human experience is largely the product of appraisal. This is why Stoicism begins with the reformation of thought. It is not about endurance. It is about lucidity. The Stoic wants to see clearly, without the fog of ego, fear, or projection. Clear sight creates calm. Calm creates resilience. Resilience creates freedom. Stoicism is often misrepresented as suppression of emotion. Marcus rejects this. He does not deny fear or sadness. He examines them. He does not flee desire. He questions it. He does not eliminate disappointment. He contextualizes it. Emotions remain, but their scale changes when interpretation changes. The mind becomes a sculptor of experience rather than a victim of perception. Marcus Aurelius's wisdom feels startlingly modern because the human mind has not changed. In the age of information overload, rapid communication, constant comparison, and digital distortion, interpretation becomes even more volatile. A single comment online can spiral into panic. A momentary setback can ignite catastrophizing. A perceived slight can become psychological collapse. But the Stoic principle remains invincible. The event and the judgment are different. Confuse them and you suffer. Separate them, and you breathe. The modern mind is overwhelmed not by reality, but by interpretation without awareness. Marcus offers remedy, not escape. He teaches vigilance of thought, discipline of perception, sovereignty of inner response. His lessons are not relics of ancient Rome. They are tools for the emotional survival of the contemporary self. And once we understand that judgment is the architect of suffering, the next question emerges naturally. If interpretation shapes pain, can altering our vantage point dissolve it? If the mind's perspective determines intensity, what happens when the perspective expands beyond the narrow boundaries of the present moment? To change the quality of our suffering, we must first change the size of the frame through which we look at life. Marcus Aurelius understood this with an intensity few rulers ever reached. After recognizing that judgment shapes experience, he pressed further, asking a more destabilizing question. What happens if we shift perspective so dramatically that our personal worries lose their sovereignty over us? The Stoics called this the view from above, but it is more than an intellectual exercise. It is a dismantling of the self's illusion that it stands at the center of the universe. Human distress grows when the mind narrows its field. A small frame magnifies minor problems until they loom with exaggerated importance. A delayed message becomes rejection. A single criticism becomes identity. An uncertain future becomes catastrophe. The mind, trapped inside its small circle, confuses the immediate with the ultimate. Marcus saw this in himself during war, plague, and betrayal. Even an emperor could become prisoner of his own focus. His remedy was not denial, but perspective. When one rises above the immediate moment in imagination, the emotional charge of the moment begins to dissolve. Marcus practiced lifting his awareness beyond the palace walls, above the camps of soldiers, above the streets of Rome, until the human drama shrank to its true scale. From this vantage, the urgency of personal anxiety weakens, not because it becomes unimportant, but because it becomes contextualized. Perspective does not delete emotion, it reduces distortion. Every individual carries private fears, private humiliations, private hopes. But from the height of the cosmic view, these private storms resemble passing weather patterns, real yet impermanent, personal yet not cosmic. This shift does not trivialize suffering. It simply returns it to correct proportion. The mind, once freed from identification with a single moment, begins to breathe again. Marcus urges us to consider the long chain of history in which our lives form only a brief flicker. Roman emperors ruled before him. Emperors would rule after him. Civilizations rose and fell with the same inevitability as waves. Human quarrels, passions, victories, and losses repeated endlessly. To see oneself as a participant in this vast pattern disrupts the illusion of exceptional personal tragedy. Our struggles remain real, but lose the false grandeur we project onto them. Yet the view from above is not escapism. Stoicism forbids flight from responsibility. Instead, it forbids distortion. When anxieties shrink to their proper size, the mind regains strategic clarity. Emotional thinking narrows possibilities. Elevated perspective expands them. With a wider frame, decisions become less reactive and more deliberate. The individual begins to respond rather than panic. This mental elevation aligns with insights from contemporary psychology. Rumination thrives on narrow focus. Catastrophizing intensifies when attention becomes claustrophobic. Cognitive behavioral therapy teaches clients to zoom out from intrusive thoughts. Mindfulness teaches them to observe without drowning. Neuroscience reveals that stress collapses perspective, while reframing opens neural pathways toward problem solving. Marcus understood these principles intuitively, centuries before they were formalized. Perspective becomes an antidote to the tyranny of immediacy. When we experience hardship, the mind declares the hardship absolute. It whispers that nothing else matters, nothing else will change, nothing else exists. But widen the frame, and the mind sees motion again. Life does not stop at the boundary of discomfort. Other elements coexist: relationships, strengths, opportunities, future choices. A crisis that seemed total becomes one element in a far larger constellation. Marcus would visualize Earth as a small sphere floating in an immense sea of darkness, with human conflicts barely perceptible from even a modest height. This was not nihilism, it was liberation. The world's noise loses its grip when one realizes how much of that noise is self-created. Fear thrives in cramped mental spaces. It weakens in open ones. The view from above also challenges ego. Ego insists that one's feelings are the center of existence. Ego asserts that offense must be avenged. Disappointment must be dramatized. Recognition must be earned. But from a cosmic perspective, ego becomes transparent fiction. Marcus reminds himself that generations before him lived, struggled, sought praise, feared death, and vanished. Their emotions felt absolute to them too, but the universe continued without pause. This recognition humbles the self, not to erase identity, but to loosen its grip. Humility, in Stoic terms, is not self-abasement. It is accurate placement of the self within the vast structure of existence. A mind that believes itself the center suffers needlessly. A mind that sees itself as part of something larger begins to act with proportion, calm, and responsibility. Perspective also transforms interpersonal conflict. When someone insults us, our instinct is to internalize the wound. But Marcus would rise mentally above the moment to observe the other person, not as an adversary, but as a small fragment of humanity, shaped by pressures, histories, and fears. From above, the insult loses its sting. We see that the person who harms us is often drowning in their own struggle. This does not excuse wrongdoing, but it shifts the emotional weight of the encounter. Consider how this shift impacts daily life. A traffic jam becomes part of a vast flow of human movement rather than personal sabotage. A delayed opportunity becomes one moment in a lifetime of unpredictable turns. A tense conversation becomes an interaction between two evolving beings. both imperfect, both vulnerable. Perspective allows compassion, not as moral obligation, but as natural consequence of seeing clearly. The view from above strengthens strategic thinking. When emotions dominate, decisions shrink to immediate relief. But when perspective widens, decisions align with long-term purpose rather than short-term reaction. Marcus ruled an empire during crisis. His ability to zoom out mentally allowed him to avoid rashness that would have destabilized Rome. Emotional leadership collapses under pressure. Strategic leadership requires distance. The modern world needs this more than ever. Life in 2025 accelerates relentlessly. Digital notifications, economic instability, political polarization, social comparison. Each contracts the mind's aperture until the present moment becomes suffocating. Marcus's practice offers antidote, deliberate expansion of consciousness. When everything feels urgent, perspective reveals what is truly essential. Yet perspective is not indifference. Stoicism does not produce apathy. Apathy withdraws from life. Stoicism reorients life. When personal worries shrink, space opens for meaningful action. The mind stops spiraling and begins engaging. Marcus believed that seeing yourself as a small part of a larger whole increases your sense of duty, not decreases it. Once ego's demands diminish, the world's needs become visible. Perspective cultivates gratitude. From above, one sees not only the fragility of life, but its richness. The daily irritations that dominate consciousness dissolve, revealing the quiet abundance that routine had obscured. Relationships, health, opportunity, breath itself. Gratitude grows not from forced positivity, but from perceptual balance. Perspective also dissolves perfectionism. The obsession with flawless outcomes fades when one sees how minor any single failure becomes in the expanse of years. A mistake loses its catastrophic aura. A misstep becomes one frame in a much larger film. This shift encourages experimentation, courage, resilience. Perfectionism shrinks life. Perspective expands it. Marcus practiced the view from above repeatedly because perspective narrows again naturally. Anxiety will always attempt to pull us back into the small frame. Ego will always attempt to place itself at the center. Perspective must be reclaimed intentionally, again and again, until it becomes habit. The Stoic knows that freedom is not granted by the world, it is earned by the mind. And once the mind has learned to shrink its worries by widening its view, another truth begins to surface, one that Marcus returned to relentlessly. If perspective can reduce fear of daily troubles, what happens when we extend this perspective to the ultimate horizon, the boundary of our existence itself? The question of death, long avoided and long feared, begins to reveal not terror, but clarity. When the mind has learned to rise above daily anxieties, when perspective has stripped personal crises of their artificial weight, the next frontier appears with sharp inevitability: death. No amount of reframing can erase its presence. No expansion of perspective can dissolve its finality. Marcus Aurelius confronted this not as a philosopher detached from life, but as a man painfully aware of the fragility of his own breath. He lost children, friends, soldiers. He governed during plague. Death traveled with him through every corridor of power, and instead of fleeing its shadow, he invited it to stand beside him as teacher. Memento mori is not a slogan. It is a discipline. It demands that the individual contemplate the end, not to induce despair, but to awaken. Death clarifies by cutting through illusion. It slices away trivial concerns with surgical precision. It forces the mind to ask what truly deserves devotion. Those who refuse to think of death drift through life without urgency. Those who face it begin to live deliberately. Marcus understood that fear of death contaminates every moment it touches. It makes us cling to pleasures anxiously. It makes us avoid decisions. It makes us compromise integrity for comfort. It makes us postpone the life we intend to live. Death becomes a distant threat that secretly governs the present. The Stoic response is not denial. It is intimacy. Bring death close enough to dissolve fear. Stare at its inevitability until its poison loses flavor. When Marcus writes that death is natural, he does not speak sentimentally. Natural does not mean comforting. It means necessary. Everything that lives depends on cycles. Everything that begins must end. Life is not chain of infinite accumulation. It is rhythm of emergence and dissolution. To resist this rhythm is to suffer. To acknowledge it is to join the order of nature willingly rather than reluctantly. Death reveals value. The finite intensifies significance. If one had unlimited days, nothing would matter. Choices would lose urgency. Commitments could be delayed indefinitely. Gratitude would fade. But because time is limited, every hour becomes precious. Scarcity gives life its shape. A life without death would be a life without edges, without meaning, without narrative. Marcus urges us to remember this whenever we slip into dull routine. Time is not guaranteed. Breath is not endless. Every moment squandered diminishes what remains. The awareness of mortality sharpens perception. One begins to see beauty in places once ignored. The warmth of sunlight on skin, the sound of rain, the pattern of leaves trembling in wind. These details, often swallowed by distraction, regain force when framed by finitude. A man who knows he will die becomes capable of seeing. A man who refuses to look at death remains blind. But memento mori demands more than philosophical contemplation. It demands psychological reorientation. Fear of death often disguises fear of incompleteness. People fear dying, not because death itself is unbearable, but because they have not lived as they know they should. They fear unfinished intentions, unspoken truths, unlived courage. Death unmasks procrastination. It exposes the gap between who we are and who we pretend to be. Marcus uses mortality as mirror. He asks, if this were your last act, would you be at peace with it? If this argument, this choice, this hesitation were replayed at the threshold of death, Would it appear justified or foolish? These questions cut deeply because they remove the illusion of unlimited time, a lie that weakens character and dilutes purpose. Contemplating death also dissolves resentment. When one recognizes that every person is temporary, anger loses its intensity. How can one remain consumed by the mistakes of another when both lives are vanishing threads in the same cosmic tapestry? Judgment softens, compassion deepens, mortality equalizes. Marcus does not encourage us to romanticize death. He encourages us to integrate it. Integration brings freedom. When the fear of losing life weakens, the fear of living authentically weakens with it. Most people live cautiously, not because caution is wise, but because they cling to life while refusing to fully inhabit it. Memento mori ends this contradiction. It demands that the individual risk expression, risk honesty, risk effort, risk rejection, because safety is illusion anyway. The Stoics believe that meditation on death liberates joy. Modern psychology agrees. Studies show that mortality awareness increases gratitude, resilience, clarity of priority. But Marcus reached these insights without research labs or theories. He learned them through the raw immediacy of imperial responsibility and human loss. His reflections were practical survival, not abstraction. The fear of death often manifests as attachment. We cling to possessions, relationships, routines, status, as if their permanence could shield us from impermanence. But consciousness of death teaches letting go, not detachment in cold sense, but freedom from grasping. To love fully is to accept eventual loss. To enjoy fully is to accept eventual change. When one stops resisting impermanence, life becomes lighter. Death also confronts the ego with its limits. Ego seeks immortality through legacy, praise, influence. But Marcus reminds himself repeatedly that even the most celebrated figures fade. Names vanish. Achievements become footnotes. Empires crumble. To tether one's worth to external memory is to bind oneself to wind. The wise person lives not for future applause, but for present alignment with reason and virtue. This shift from external to internal orientation transforms existence. When death is accepted, the need to impress dissolves. The desire to dominate fades. Life becomes less about performance and more about presence. Marcus writes that we should live in such a way that even if the world misunderstands our actions, we are at peace because our actions align with our principles. Mortality removes the audience. Awareness of death heightens urgency, but not desperation. Urgency commits us to action. Desperation undermines action. Stoicism cultivates the former while rejecting the latter. The man who accepts death moves quickly but calmly. He wastes no time, yet panics at nothing. His days become structured by intention rather than drift. In the modern world of 2025, death remains taboo. People avoid discussing it, avoid witnessing it, avoid reflecting upon it. Technology promises extension. Medicine promises delay. Culture promises distraction. But avoidance amplifies fear. What is unexamined becomes monstrous. The Stoic looks directly at what others flee. That gaze diminishes terror. Death also reframes suffering. To know that life is fragile invites a deeper respect for its experiences, even painful ones. Some sorrows become meaningful when viewed as finite chapters rather than eternal burdens. The person who acknowledges death becomes more patient with difficulties, more tolerant of imperfection, more grateful for ordinary blessings. The finite nature of existence thickens experience. Marcus uses mortality to expose pettiness. When he feels irritation rising, he reminds himself that both he and the offender will soon be dust. When ambition inflates his ego, he remembers past emperors who died and were forgotten. When he feels overwhelmed by responsibility, he recalls the shortness of life and the absurdity of wasting it on self-inflicted torment. This perspective is not nihilism. It is liberation from triviality. Memento mori is also preparation, not preparation for an afterlife, but preparation for courage. When death is familiar, decisions become simpler. Should one speak the truth? Death is coming. Speak. Should one act justly? Death is coming. Act. Should one forgive? Death is coming. Free yourself. Should one pursue a meaningful project? Death is coming. Begin. This clarity removes hesitation. The awareness of death compresses time. It forces the individual to acknowledge that waiting is luxury he cannot afford. Marcus asks, "What are you postponing and why?" Mortality dismantles illusion of endless opportunity. It forces choice. Yet the contemplation of death does something even more profound. It reveals the preciousness of the present. When we understand that the moment before us may never return, we stop treating the present as corridor to something better. We inhabit it, we penetrate it, we live in it rather than around it. Marcus advises himself to perform each action as if it were the final offering of his life. This is not pressure, it is reverence. The present becomes luminous under the shadow of death. Ordinary tasks gain sacredness. Conversations become richer. Relationships become deeper. Even solitude becomes more honest. One stops seeking constant stimulation and begins seeking clarity. Mortality quiets noise. Yet there is a further implication, one Marcus moves toward gradually. If death clarifies what matters, it also clarifies what does not. Much of human suffering comes from attempts to control what lies beyond reach. People grasp at outcomes, manipulate circumstances, obsess over reputation, fear unpredictability. But death exposes the futility of such efforts. To die is to lose control completely. And if ultimate control is impossible, then the attempt to control everything else becomes absurd. Thus, the contemplation of death prepares the mind for another Stoic revelation, the division between what is truly ours and what never was. Once death has stripped away illusion and revealed the fragile limit of our days, the next realization unfolds with an equally unsettling clarity. Much of what torments us lies outside our control. This truth, which Marcus Aurelius returns to again and again, is not meant to diminish human agency. it is meant to refine it. For the mind wastes its strength when it pours energy into altering what is immovable. The Stoics understood that despair is often born not from pain itself, but from the refusal to accept the boundaries of influence. The division between what is ours and what is not becomes the foundation of psychological freedom. Marcus writes that the universe moves according to its own rhythm, indifferent to human desire. Seasons change, bodies age, people behave according to their natures. Outcomes unfold in patterns far larger than individual. Intention. To resist this is to be crushed by inevitability. But to understand the distinction between what can be guided and what must be accepted is to stop fighting ghosts. It is to reserve one's force for what can actually be shaped. The trap of control begins with expectation. People expect the world to align with their wishes. They expect others to behave predictably. They expect success to follow effort automatically. They expect fairness, stability, clarity. And when the world deviates, and it always does, the mind interprets this deviation as personal affront. Suffering intensifies because expectation, not reality, has been violated. Stoicism pierces this illusion. It does not eliminate desire or ambition. It eliminates the belief that desire guarantees outcome. It replaces the fantasy of control with the discipline of responsibility. Marcus insists that our domain is narrow but powerful. We command only our judgments, actions, and responses. Everything else lies beyond. Governance. Attempting to control the external dissolves energy. Strength is conserved only when spent internally. This division protects the mind from drowning in chaos. If one reacts to every external fluctuation, life becomes perpetual upheaval. Opinions of others shift like tides. Fortune rises and falls. Circumstances transform without warning. To base stability on external forces is to build a fortress out of sand. Marcus refuses this architecture. He builds inwardly where storms cannot reach. Even as emperor, commanding armies and governing millions, he recognized that he could not control outcomes. He could only act in accordance with reason and virtue. Victory, loss, reputation, sickness, all existed beyond his command. This humility is not weakness, it is precision. It is recognition of limits that protect rather than diminish. The modern world of 2025 amplifies the illusion of control. Technology offers instant gratification, giving the impression that reality should respond to every preference. Social media reinforces the belief that one can curate the world, filtering unpleasantness and amplifying comfort. But life remains stubbornly uncurated. Illness appears, misunderstandings erupt, economic structures shift, people disappoint. The individual is reminded again and again that control is fantasy. Marcus's wisdom becomes antidote. When confronted with difficulty, he asks a single cutting question. Is this within my control? If yes, act. If no, release. This binary saves the psyche from unnecessary torment. Most suffering comes from refusing to release what cannot be altered. The Stoic learns to surrender not out of resignation, but out of clarity. Surrender, in this sense, is strength. It frees mental bandwidth. It removes friction. It allows the individual to focus entirely on what he can influence: his character, his effort, his conduct. Anxiety weakens because anxiety feeds on attempts to manage the uncontrollable. When the uncontrollable is relinquished, anxiety starves. Yet releasing control does not mean passivity. Stoicism rejects fatalism. Fate shapes conditions, not actions. The individual must still act with courage, integrity, and intelligence. Marcus does not advocate withdrawal from responsibility. He advocates purification of responsibility. He removes everything that dilutes action, everything that contaminates intention. This clarity produces calm. Calm is not silence of emotion, but alignment of priorities. The mind stops scattering its energy across impossible tasks and concentrates instead on shaping its own stance. Emotional turbulence softens because the individual stops demanding that life obey his preferences. Instead, he commits to responding wisely to whatever arises. The principle of distinguishing between what is and is not under control also reshapes relationships. Much interpersonal suffering emerges from attempts to change others. People try to reform personalities, manipulate outcomes, guarantee affection, force understanding. Marcus recognized early that other minds are sovereign. One may influence through example, but one cannot command another's inner world. Accepting this reduces resentment. It redirects energy towards self-conduct rather than external coercion. This acceptance also dissolves pride. The ego believes it should control how others see it. It wants admiration, agreement, applause. But Marcus learned that reputation is not ours. It is shaped by the perceptions of others, perceptions built from their experiences, fears, biases, and desires. To tether one's worth to such volatile ground is to guarantee instability. Stoic calm arises when one cares more about being good than being seen as good. Control also extends to physical circumstances. Illness, weather, age, and external conditions rarely obey personal preference. Marcus lectures himself repeatedly to remember that the body is not the self. It is a vessel, subject to decay, influenced by forces beyond human governance. To fight this truth is to suffer twice, once from the condition and again from the judgment that the condition is unfair. Acceptance is not surrender. It is refusal to multiply suffering. The Stoics teach that life becomes lighter when control is confined to its rightful boundaries. The individual becomes more agile. Adaptation becomes natural. When one stops trying to force reality into specific shapes, one learns to move with it. Flexibility replaces rigidity. Openness replaces resistance. The universe becomes collaborator rather than adversary. This internal reorientation transforms stress. Stress arises not from events, but from attachment to specific outcomes. When outcomes are released and effort becomes primary, stress loses its grip. The individual still works diligently, but his peace does not depend on results. Peace comes from alignment between inner values and outer actions. Marcus embodies this paradoxical state, deeply committed, yet inwardly detached. The wisdom of control also sharpens moral responsibility. Once external forces are acknowledged as beyond reach, excuses weaken. The individual can no longer blame circumstances, luck, or the behavior of others for his character. Responsibility becomes internalized. One cannot control insults, but one can control whether to respond with dignity or pettiness. One cannot control injustice, but one can control whether to act with integrity or cowardice. This empowerment strengthens identity. Acceptance of limited control does not shrink ambition. It purifies ambition. Instead of seeking dominance over the world, one seeks mastery over self. Instead of manipulating outcomes, one cultivates excellence in action. The individual stops asking life for guarantees and begins asking himself for consistency. Marcus shows that this shift transforms ambition from ego-driven hunger into disciplined purpose. And once this inner sovereignty takes root, another truth emerges. The universe itself operates according to an order that transcends individual will. To align with this order is to reduce suffering. To resist it is to multiply frustration. Logos, the Stoic concept of rational structure underlying nature, becomes not metaphysical doctrine, but practical orientation. The individual who has accepted the limits of control becomes capable of seeing the broader pattern in which his life unfolds. Once the boundaries of control become clear and the mind ceases wasting its strength on the impossible, another dimension of Stoic thought emerges with quiet force. Marcus Aurelius begins to speak not merely about what we govern, but about the structure that governs us. He turns his attention to the architecture of the universe itself, the order beneath chaos, the coherence beneath apparent randomness. To Marcus, the world is not accident. It is a system woven with reason, pattern, rhythm. He calls this logos, and for him, aligning with this order is not an act of faith, but an act of psychological liberation. Modern readers often misunderstand this. They imagine logos as religious doctrine or metaphysical speculation. But Marcus does not treat it this way. For him, logos is orientation, not dogma. It is the choice to see life as intelligible rather than hostile, connected rather than fragmented, meaningful rather than absurd. It is recognition that everything unfolds through causes, and that each event fits into a network of relationships far too complex for any single mind to perceive fully. This recognition does not diminish agency, it expands perspective. Marcus observes that nature does nothing without purpose, and while he never pretends to understand the full machinery behind existence, he trusts that the universe operates according to principles larger than individual desire. This trust is not superstition. It is the psychological stance of someone who refuses to believe he is victim of arbitrary chaos. Belief in logos stabilizes the mind. It allows Marcus to face adversity without assuming malice in the universe. When hardship arises, he interprets it not as cosmic attack, but as natural consequence. This reframing transforms resistance into cooperation. To see oneself as part of a greater system changes one's relationship to suffering. Pain becomes not punishment, but process. Disappointment becomes data. Change becomes continuity. The Stoic does not ask, "Why is this happening to me?" He asks, "How does this fit into the order of things?" And this question dissolves the poison of self-pity. It replaces resentment with curiosity. It converts chaos into context. This worldview aligns surprisingly well with 2025's understanding of systems. Science reveals interconnectedness in every domain: ecosystems, economies, neural networks, cosmology. Randomness is not pure randomness. It exists within probabilistic frameworks. Complexity obeys rules that transcend individual events. Marcus intuits what modern theory articulates. We are nodes in a vast, interdependent web, shaped by forces that operate at scales both microscopic and cosmic. To resist the flow of such a system is to fracture oneself. The individual who demands that life conform to his expectations will always collide with the structure of reality. But the one who seeks to understand the flow can adapt, adjust, move fluidly. Marcus's acceptance of logos is thus less theological than strategic. It gives him a way to interpret events without collapsing under their weight. He writes that whatever happens is either bearable or not. If it is bearable, endure it. And if it is not, it will end you quickly. Beneath these words lies deep trust in the order of existence. Not blind trust, but chosen trust. A trust that frees the individual from constant anxiety about what might come next. If the universe operates according to principles, then fear becomes less necessary. Preparation replaces panic. Seeing the world as ordered also deepens Marcus's sense of responsibility. If he is part of a larger system, then his actions must harmonize with that system. He is not isolated, not exempt, not sovereign in the adolescent sense of doing whatever he pleases. He has a role, a function. Just as the hand exists for the body, the individual exists for the community. Logos redefines duty, not as obligation forced from outside, but as natural coherence with the whole. This shift transforms power. Instead of domination, Marcus embraces cooperation. Instead of imposing his will on reality, he molds his will through reality. He becomes participant in the world, not its adversary. His leadership reflects this orientation. He governs not as master of an empire, but as steward of a complex organism. He sees Roman society as living structure, with each person contributing to the whole. Logos eliminates the delusion of isolation. Recognition of cosmic order also tempers fear of change. If the universe is dynamic, system composed of cycles, transitions, convergence, dissolution, then change is not aberration but essence. Marcus writes that all things transform continually, and resisting this transformation intensifies suffering. The Stoic adapts because he knows change is law, not exception. Accepting change does not weaken action, it clarifies purpose. One stops wasting time defending permanence that never existed. Logos also reveals unity. Marcus emphasizes that all humans share the same nature, the same breath, the same transient condition. We are fragments of the same fire, drops from the same sea. This worldview dismantles arrogance. How can one feel superior when all are subject to the same fragility? How can one indulge hatred when the other is extension of the same cosmic material? Seeing oneself in the context of a universal structure breeds humility, compassion, and responsibility. Yet the Stoic does not lose individuality in this unity. Instead, individuality becomes expression of universal reason. The task is not to dissolve into the whole, but to perform one's function excellently within it. Marcus reminds himself that even a leaf has purpose, and so does he. Understanding the larger design gives meaning to the smaller role. The belief in cosmic order does not erase grief or uncertainty. Marcus still suffers. He still questions. He still confronts loss. But his suffering becomes more bearable because it is not interpreted as error. Pain is permitted in this system. It is expression of natural law. He does not ask the universe to remove hardship. He asks himself to respond with integrity. This approach creates resilience. When difficulty arrives, the Stoic does not collapse into victimhood. He does not demand exemption. He simply aligns his mind with necessity. What must be endured is endured. What can be improved is improved. What belongs to fate is accepted. What belongs to virtue is cultivated. This clarity gives him strength that external circumstances cannot shatter. Logos also dissolves self-centeredness. When one sees oneself as part of a larger design, personal suffering becomes less absolute. The universe is not hostile, it is indifferent. But this indifference is not cruelty, it is neutrality. The Stoic finds peace in this neutrality because it frees him from imagining cosmic judgment. Events unfold according to nature, not moral condemnation. This liberates the mind from guilt and paranoia. In daily practice, Marcus uses this worldview to navigate chaos. When confronted with betrayal, he tells himself that humans act according to their understanding. When confronted with illness, he reminds himself that bodies follow biological law. When confronted with uncertainty, he recalls that the future, like the past, belongs to the order of things. His task is not to control the order, but to participate in it skillfully. Recognizing logos also reframes ambition. The individual no longer strives for control over fate, but for harmony with it. Ambition becomes less about conquering the world and more about mastering oneself within the world. The Stoic becomes ambitious in discipline, courageous in action, humble in expectation. His ambition deepens because it is freed from fantasy. This harmony with the universe produces serenity, but not laziness. Marcus does not withdraw into contemplation. His understanding of cosmic order compels him toward action, service, and moral clarity. If he is part of a rational system, then he must behave rationally. Thought must translate into deed. Understanding must translate into contribution. This movement toward contribution becomes natural extension of logos. Once one sees oneself as fragment of a larger organism, one cannot help but recognize the importance of serving that organism. Duty becomes expression of unity. Service becomes expression of coherence. The self no longer lives for its own preservation alone. It becomes agent of the collective order. And gradually, this sense of belonging to a vast and intelligent structure leads Marcus toward another profound realization. If the universe is ordered, and if each individual is part of that order, then moral excellence cannot remain abstract. It must manifest through the virtues that sustain both the individual and the whole. Virtue becomes not religious command, but psychological architecture. And from this architecture arise the four pillars of a life capable of moving through chaos without losing its shape. Once Marcus has situated himself within the vast structure of an ordered universe, once he accepts that human life is a thread woven into a larger pattern, the next demand rises naturally from this realization. If the world is coherent, then the individual must become coherent. If nature expresses its order through cycles and laws, then character must express its order through virtues. Virtue, for Marcus, is not moral decoration. It is psychological architecture. It is the internal scaffolding that allows a person to remain intact when everything external breaks apart. The Stoics call these virtues wisdom, justice, courage, and temperance. But Marcus does not treat them as abstract principles. He treats them as tools for survival, lenses for perceiving reality, forms of internal governance. Virtue is not performance, it is strength. Without virtue, the mind collapses into impulse. Without virtue, freedom dissolves into chaos. Without virtue, perspective and cosmic understanding become hollow. Virtue is what turns philosophy into life. Wisdom comes first because without it, the other virtues lose direction. Wisdom is not accumulation of knowledge. It is clarity. It is the ability to see what is happening without distortion, to separate appearance from truth, to recognize where one's power begins and ends. Wisdom demands ruthless honesty. It asks the individual to examine motives, desires, fears, biases. It requires stripping away self-flattering narratives and facing the raw architecture of one's own mind. Marcus cultivates wisdom through constant interrogation of judgment. Every time emotion flickers, he asks, is this rooted in fact or interpretation? Every time fear rises, he asks, is this within my control? Every time anger swells, he asks, what expectation has been violated? Wisdom transforms reaction into understanding. It gives the individual space between stimulus and response. In this space, freedom grows. Justice follows naturally because a clear mind recognizes interdependence. Justice is not legal system. It is recognition that one belongs to a community and therefore must act in a way that strengthens that community. Justice demands fairness, empathy, contribution. It insists that the self is not sovereign entity, but part of a living organism. Marcus knows that an emperor who seeks personal gain destroys himself along with Rome. Justice is coherence between the self and the whole. Courage emerges next because wisdom and justice without action are hollow. Courage is not recklessness. It is endurance. It is the willingness to face difficulty without fleeing, to act rightly even when the outcome is uncertain, to remain steady in the face of fear. Courage does not eliminate fear. It prevents fear from becoming ruler of the mind. Courage keeps the individual from collapsing inward when external pressure intensifies. Temperance completes the structure because it regulates impulse. Temperance is not self-denial, but self-mastery. It prevents excess from poisoning clarity. It ensures that desire does not distort judgment, that anger does not override wisdom, that pleasure does not corrupt discipline. Temperance is balance. Without it, the mind becomes captive to appetite. With it, the mind becomes sovereign. Together, these four virtues form a psychological fortress. They are not commandments imposed from outside, but capacities developed from within. Each virtue strengthens the others. Wisdom guides justice. Justice motivates courage. Courage requires temperance. Temperance protects wisdom. Marcus understood that a life aligned with nature must also be aligned internally. Disorder in the mind destroys coherence with the universe. Yet the Stoic does not pursue virtue for reputation. Virtue cannot be displayed for applause because applause lies outside control. Virtue must be cultivated privately, relentlessly, even secretly. Marcus writes for himself, not for an audience. His reflections are reminders, corrections, reorientations. Virtue is not born from theory, but from daily discipline. It is exercise, not ornament. Understanding the virtues also changes how Marcus interprets hardship. Difficulty becomes opportunity to practice virtue. Injustice becomes opportunity for justice. Fear becomes opportunity for courage. Temptation becomes opportunity for temperance. Confusion becomes opportunity for wisdom. Life ceases to be obstacle course and becomes training ground. Every challenge becomes material for strengthening the self. This shift in perspective transforms suffering. When hardship is interpreted as arena for virtue, suffering gains purpose. It becomes not senseless torment, but test of character. Modern psychology echoes this insight. Resilience grows when individuals interpret adversity as meaningful. Marcus knew this intuitively. Virtue thrives under pressure. Without difficulty, courage remains theoretical. Without irritation, patience remains hypothetical. Without injustice, fairness remains abstract. Virtue needs resistance to reveal itself. The four virtues also reshape decision-making. Instead of asking what will bring pleasure or comfort, Marcus asks what aligns with wisdom, justice, courage, and temperance. This question removes noise. It simplifies life. Decisions become less about preference and more about integrity. Ambition becomes less about winning and more about living rightly. Marcus does not ask whether he will be praised. He asks whether he will respect himself. This internal metric liberates the individual from external chaos. If one's compass is internal, external fluctuations cannot mislead. The Stoic becomes consistent, not because life is stable, but because his values remain stable. This stability is not rigidity, it is coherence. Even when fortune turns, the inner structure stands. Virtue becomes continuity amid change. But virtue is not static, it evolves. Wisdom deepens as the individual confronts new complexities. Justice expands as empathy grows. Courage strengthens with each act of endurance. Temperance sharpens as self-awareness increases. Marcus never treats virtue as achievement. It is practice without finish line. The human being is always becoming, and virtue provides direction for that becoming. The four virtues also dissolve internal conflict. Much psychological suffering arises from competing desires, contradictory impulses, and fractured identity. Virtue integrates these fragments. Wisdom clarifies priorities. Justice provides purpose. Courage energizes action. Temperance regulates extremes. The self becomes unified rather than scattered. Unity brings peace. Without virtue, the mind becomes battlefield. With virtue, the mind becomes instrument. Marcus's emphasis on virtue also reveals his understanding of power. True power is not domination, but self-command. An emperor who cannot control his anger, fear, or desire is slave to his own mind. Virtue frees him. It gives him sovereignty where it matters most, in his relationship with himself. External power can be stripped away instantly. Internal power remains. The modern world of 2025 longs for virtue, but misunderstands it. Society praises productivity, success, visibility. But these achievements without virtue produce emptiness. Marcus understood that character, not circumstance, determines fulfillment. A man may possess wealth, beauty, status, influence, and still be miserable if his inner world is chaotic. Virtue provides order where external achievements cannot. Virtue also clarifies the role of emotion. Stoicism does not reject emotion. It rejects enslavement by emotion. Wisdom examines emotion. Justice humanizes emotion. Courage acts despite emotion. Temperance moderates emotion. The Stoic does not numb himself. He understands himself. This understanding prevents emotional storms from determining action. Emotion becomes signal, not command. Another dimension of virtue reveals itself when Marcus examines the relationship between thought and action. He reminds himself that philosophy is worthless if it remains theoretical. Virtue must transform behavior. It must influence speech, choices, relationships, leadership. Marcus knows that intellectual clarity without moral discipline produces hypocrisy. Action is proof of philosophy. Without action, virtue is ornament rather than structure. The four virtues also intersect with the Stoic idea of living according to nature. To live according to nature means to live rationally, socially, and purposefully. Wisdom enables rationality. Justice preserves social bonds. Courage drives purposeful action. Temperance maintains harmony within the self. Virtue is therefore not imposed upon human nature, but reveals its highest potential. Through this lens, Marcus sees that moral excellence is not luxury, it is survival. It allows the individual to navigate a world filled with unpredictability, injustice, and impermanence. Without virtue, life collapses under pressure. With virtue, pressure becomes catalyst for transformation. And once Marcus constructs this inner architecture, once virtue becomes the structure through which he interprets and engages the world, another realization begins to surface. If the self is strengthened, if the inner world is ordered, and if life is understood as participation in a larger system, then existence cannot be confined to individual expression alone. Human beings are not solitary entities. They are social creatures, woven into communities, bound by shared destiny. Virtue demands not only internal excellence, but contribution to others. Once Marcus recognizes that virtue demands contribution, once the inner architecture of wisdom, justice, courage, and temperance becomes solid enough to withstand the turbulence of private struggle, he turns outward with a sharper, heavier understanding of what it means to live among other human beings. Stoicism does not permit the fantasy of isolation. To be human is to be woven into the fabric of humanity, bound by the logic of mutual interdependence. Marcus insists that we exist for one another, not as expendable accessories, but as essential participants in a shared cosmic function. This view does not romanticize humanity. Marcus has been betrayed, challenged, misunderstood. He has seen cruelty in the Senate, corruption in the army, selfishness in his closest circles. Yet he does not allow bitterness to distort his vision. He refuses to let disappointment poison his understanding of human nature. Instead, he confronts the reality of flawed individuals and still insists on responsibility toward them. This is not naive optimism. It is existential discipline. Marcus understands that humans are imperfect because nature itself evolves through imperfection. People act from fear, ignorance, ego, confusion. Their flaws arise from causes beyond their awareness. To resent them is to resent cause and effect. To expect perfection is to reject the nature of the world. Marcus urges himself repeatedly, remember that people do wrong out of mistaken belief about what is good. They are not malicious by essence. They are limited by perception. Recognizing this dissolves anger. Anger requires belief that others intentionally choose to injure us. But if their mistakes stem from inner distortion rather than deliberate cruelty, anger loses its justification. Marcus trains himself to replace anger with understanding, not out of weakness, but out of clarity. Anger disrupts the mind. Understanding reorders it. The Stoic does not excuse harmful behavior, but interprets it through the lens of human limitation. Human connection is not grounded in idealism. It is grounded in realism. Marcus understands that he shares the same tendencies he condemns in others. He too acts from fear, ego, and misunderstanding. He too fails, misjudges, and hurts without intention. This recognition destroys moral superiority. It produces humility, which is the soil of compassion. Compassion for Marcus is not emotional softness. It is logical coherence. If all humans struggle under the weight of flawed perception, then one must respond to them, not with rage, but with patience. Yet Stoic compassion does not compromise justice. Marcus still holds individuals accountable for their actions. But accountability is guided by reason, not vengeance. Revenge poisons the mind. and he refuses to drink from that cup. His duty is to act in accordance with justice, not emotional impulse. Doing harm in response to harm corrupts the self. Justice must remain anchored in virtue, not reaction. This approach transforms leadership. Marcus leads millions, yet he never allows power to isolate him from humanity. He does not view himself as superior, but as servant of the whole. He consistently reminds himself that leadership exists to improve the lives of others, not inflate the ego of the leader. Leadership without compassion becomes tyranny. Leadership without justice becomes corruption. Leadership without wisdom becomes chaos. Marcus's internal discipline keeps him from falling into these traps. But Stoicism does not limit compassion to leadership. It applies to every relationship: family, colleagues, adversaries, strangers. Marcus believes that every person you meet is engaged in a private battle you cannot see. Their anger may mask fear. Their arrogance may mask insecurity. Their coldness may mask pain. To respond with hostility only deepens the wound. To respond with clarity becomes an act of healing, not only for them, but for oneself. However, Stoic compassion is not indulgence. Marcus does not sacrifice his integrity to please others. He does not allow manipulation in the name of kindness. Compassion must coexist with boundaries, or it becomes self-betrayal. The Stoic must contribute to humanity without absorbing its dysfunction. This balance requires strength. Too much softness invites collapse. Too much rigidity invites cruelty. Marcus navigates this balance by returning always to virtue as compass. Human connection also demands forgiveness. Forgiveness is not erasure of wrongdoing. It is release of hostility. Carrying resentment chains the mind to injury. Marcus refuses this chain. He forgives not because others deserve it, but because he refuses to corrupt his own inner world with bitterness. Forgiveness is self-protection. It frees attention for action rather than rumination. Community is not optional for Marcus. It is natural law. He compares humanity to limbs of the same body. To harm another is to harm oneself. To isolate oneself is to weaken the whole. The Stoic sees the self as cell of a greater organism. One must function in harmony with the organism or decay inwardly. Even when people behave destructively, they remain part of the system. The challenge is not to eliminate them, but to integrate them through understanding and justice. This sense of interdependence reshapes responsibility. Marcus believes one must contribute to the common good, not because of external pressure, but because the good of others is inseparable from the good of the self. Compassion becomes rational strategy, not sentimental gesture. Society thrives when individuals elevate their character. Collapse begins when individuals retreat into selfishness. Marcus carries this awareness constantly, especially when he feels tempted to withdraw out of exhaustion or disappointment. In the modern landscape of 2025, human connection is paradoxical. Technology multiplies contact but weakens intimacy. People communicate constantly, yet feel increasingly isolated. Judgment becomes instantaneous. Empathy becomes scarce. Outrage spreads faster than understanding. Marcus's insistence on seeing the humanity beneath behavior becomes more urgent in such conditions. Without conscious effort to understand, people fragment into hostile tribes. Without compassion grounded in clarity, society decays into conflict. Marcus teaches that to live harmoniously with others, one must purify one's own motives. If you feel offended, examine why. If you feel superior, examine why. If you feel threatened, examine why. Stoicism demands continual psychological excavation. Relationships become mirrors of the self. Before demanding virtue from others, Marcus demands it from himself. This inward discipline transforms conflict resolution. When disagreement arises, Marcus does not escalate. He listens, analyzes, clarifies. He asks whether the conflict stems from facts or interpretation. Often conflict arises from miscommunication rather than malice. By approaching others with curiosity rather than hostility, he diffuses tension. People respond differently when they sense they are being understood rather than judged. Marcus also recognizes that some individuals remain harmful despite understanding and patience. The Stoic response is not hatred, but distance. If a person repeatedly harms the social fabric, one must protect the integrity of the whole. Distance is not punishment, it is measure for preserving virtue. Stoicism teaches that one can care for humanity without allowing destructive individuals to corrupt the inner world. Compassion must be wise, or it dissolves into self-destruction. The recognition of shared humanity also reframes loneliness. Loneliness arises when one believes he is disconnected, misunderstood, singular in suffering. Marcus dissolves this illusion by reminding himself that every human experiences the same fears, longings, frustrations, limitations. He is not alone. He is part of universal struggle. This awareness provides silent companionship. It gives suffering dignity instead of isolation. Human connection also becomes pathway for self-transcendence. When one participates in something larger, the ego loosens. The mind becomes less obsessed with personal grievances, ambitions, insecurities. Service redirects energy outward, reducing inner turmoil. Marcus finds meaning precisely in fulfilling his role within humanity. He does not seek glory, but contribution. Contribution quiets the ego more effectively than withdrawal ever could. And yet, even as Marcus embraces community, he remains acutely aware that society can corrupt as easily as it can uplift. Public opinion, cultural pressure, and mass emotion can distort judgment. The individual must engage with humanity while maintaining sovereignty of mind. Connection must not become conformity. Compassion must not become surrender. Marcus insists that one must work with others, but think independently. This tension sharpens the demand for inner strength. To remain just in unjust environments, courageous in fearful environments, wise in confused environments, and temperate in indulgent environments requires resilience that cannot be borrowed from others. This resilience arises only through daily discipline. Marcus cultivates it to prevent society from shaping him in its image, rather than allowing him to strengthen society through his. Interdependence reveals ethical responsibility, but it also reveals vulnerability. Because humans are bound to one another, the suffering of one becomes the suffering of all. Marcus feels the weight of this truth in every political decision, every military order, every judgment he makes. Compassion does not lighten the burden of leadership, it intensifies it, but it also gives direction. When decisions are grounded in concern for the whole, clarity emerges through the fog of doubt. Competing pressures. As Marcus refines his understanding of human connection, a deeper, more challenging insight begins to take shape. If we are bound to others by nature, and if virtue must guide our actions within this collective fabric, then the final test of character emerges not in solitude or introspection, but in action itself. The Stoic must bring all these internal developments into the realm of choice, decision, commitment, and responsibility. He must become capable not merely of reflection, but of decisive, disciplined action. Action becomes the crucible where every Stoic principle is tested, stripped, and proven. After all the inner work Marcus demands, the reshaping of judgment, the widening of perspective, the acceptance of death, the relinquishing of control, the alignment with cosmic order, the cultivation of virtue, the commitment to humanity, none of it matters unless it translates into movement. Knowledge unexpressed becomes decay. Virtue unacted becomes ornament. Reflection without execution becomes paralysis disguised as depth. Marcus refuses the luxury of contemplation without consequence. He knows that philosophy which does not produce action is merely self-decoration. The Stoic must act, but he must act from clarity, not impulse. Marcus insists that hesitation is the silent enemy of purpose. The mind fabricates delays. It invents reasons to wait. It tells stories about insufficient preparation, unfavorable timing, potential failure. These stories wear the mask of prudence, but rot into avoidance. Marcus sees this clearly. The moment you hesitate, you surrender sovereignty to fear. Action is the only antidote. Yet the Stoic does not rush blindly. He demands inner alignment before movement. Action must arise from what is just, not what is convenient. From what is wise, not what is impulsive. From what is courageous, not what is comfortable. This balance between urgency and integrity forms the backbone of his discipline. Marcus writes that the task before you is the one life has assigned. Delaying it is rebellion against nature. Nature does not hesitate. Rivers flow, seasons change, bodies age. Human hesitation becomes unnatural interruption of the world's rhythm. Action grounded in Stoic discipline has three characteristics: simplicity, focus, and duty. Simplicity means removing everything unnecessary from effort. Marcus despises overcomplication. Complexity becomes refuge for avoidance. He cuts through confusion by asking what must be done right now, with the tools available, in the conditions given. Focus means concentration on the task at hand without scattering the mind across imagined futures. Duty means acting not for personal glory, but for alignment with virtue and contribution to the whole. Action also requires emotional independence. If one waits to feel motivated, action fails. If one waits for ideal circumstances, action collapses. If one waits for universal approval, action dies. Marcus insists that the mind must override mood. Mood is weather. Action is choice. A man ruled by feeling cannot act consistently. A man ruled by principle acts regardless of feeling. In the modern landscape of 2025, passivity has become epidemic. Endless information dulls initiative. Constant comparison breeds paralysis. People wait for the right path instead of walking the path they can create. Marcus would see this passivity as misuse of the mind's power. He would demand motion, not as frantic productivity, but as purposeful contribution. Action becomes proof that one has not given up sovereignty. Marcus also teaches that action must remain free from obsession with result. The moment action becomes dependent on outcome, anxiety corrupts it. The Stoic focuses on effort, not consequence. Consequences lie outside control. Action lies within. When effort aligns with virtue, the outcome becomes secondary. This detachment breeds resilience. Failure loses its threat. Success loses its intoxication. Action becomes expression of character rather than bid for validation. This perspective makes the Stoic relentless but calm. He persists not because he expects the world to reward him, but because to stop acting would violate his nature. Discipline becomes its own reward. The path becomes its own justification. Marcus acts not because he is certain, but because he refuses to betray his principles through stagnation. Action also clarifies identity. When the mind moves from reflection into execution, it discovers capacities unknown during contemplation. Strength reveals itself only in use. Courage expands only in confrontation. Wisdom sharpens only in application. Marcus believes the self is sculpted through action, not thought. The individual becomes what he repeatedly chooses to do. Action is self-creation. Yet the Stoic must guard against frenzy. Action without reflection becomes chaos. Marcus insists on economy of movement. Do what needs to be done, he tells himself, but do not exhaust yourself in pursuits born of vanity or restlessness. The Stoic takes deliberate steps, not frantic leaps. He eliminates waste. He refuses distraction. His pace is steady, not frantic, because frenzy is a form of fear disguised as ambition. He confronts another paradox. Effective action requires acceptance of imperfection. If one demands flawless execution, he will never begin. Marcus knows that humans act as flawed instruments in a flawed world. Action need not be perfect. It need only be sincere, grounded, and aligned with virtue. Progress matters more than precision. The Stoic creates momentum by allowing imperfection without surrendering discipline. Action also interacts deeply with community. Since humans exist for one another, action must serve more than the self. Marcus evaluates each decision through the lens of its impact on the whole. Action divorced from social responsibility becomes corruption of virtue. The Stoic acts not only to advance personal strength, but to contribute to collective harmony. Service becomes extension of internal coherence. However, Marcus also recognizes that action often invites misunderstanding. People resist change. They criticize initiative. They misinterpret confidence as arrogance, clarity as coldness, discipline as rigidity. The Stoic cannot allow such judgments to derail him. Public opinion lies outside control. The purpose of action is integrity, not applause. Marcus acts quietly, decisively, without ceremony. Action forces the Stoic to confront the limits of time. Life is short. and shortened further by hesitation, distraction, and indulgence. Marcus repeatedly reminds himself that each day might be his last. This is not morbid pessimism, but fuel for urgency. If death is constant companion, procrastination becomes betrayal. The Stoic acts because the window for action is shrinking. From this awareness emerges a new kind of calm intensity. Marcus moves through the world with unshakable steadiness because he knows exactly what belongs to him, his choices, and he knows exactly what does not, the results. This clarity frees him from despair and from exhilaration. He remains grounded whether praised or condemned, successful or defeated. His identity is anchored not in what he achieves, but in how he acts. And yet, as Marcus refines his understanding of action, a deeper tension surfaces. If action must be guided by virtue and aligned with cosmic order, then each moment demands not only movement, but presence. The Stoic cannot scatter himself across past and future. He must inhabit the present fully, because the present is the only arena where action exists. The next step in Marcus's thought pushes this truth to its absolute conclusion. Presence becomes the final discipline Marcus Aurelius demands from himself, the sharpest refinement of Stoic philosophy, the point where all previous insights converge into a single imperative. Be here completely. Once action is understood as the expression of virtue, once the mind is freed from fear of death, once the limits of control are recognized, once the universe reveals its order, once compassion binds us to humanity, the final obstacle arises from within. The mind drifts. It escapes into memory or projection. It abandons the moment in favor of illusions. Presence becomes the battleground on which mastery is either won or lost. Marcus sees that most human suffering does not come from the present moment itself, but from the mind's refusal to remain in it. The past resurrects itself through regret, guilt, nostalgia. The future appears as anxiety, fantasy, dread. Both ghosts steal attention from the only place where choice exists. Marcus refuses to let his life be devoured by shadows. He reminds himself that the present is the only possession he truly holds. Everything else is either dead or unborn. The mind fears the present because the present is raw. It contains no buffers, no filters, no narratives. To be fully present means to confront life as it is, without embellishment or avoidance. It means seeing oneself clearly without the protective veil of memory or fantasy. This clarity can feel violent. It exposes the individual to the naked truth of his circumstances, his strengths, his weaknesses. Presence tears away illusion. Marcus does not flinch from this. He demands brutal honesty with the now. He writes that the present moment is sufficient, not because it is always pleasant, but because it is real. Reality, no matter how difficult, is navigable. Illusion is not. The present offers actionable material. The past cannot be changed. The future cannot be controlled. But the present can be shaped, interpreted, acted upon. Presence is power. Marcus also knows the present is fleeting. It does not linger long enough to justify hesitation. To delay is to betray the moment. He trains himself to meet each moment as if it were the whole of life compressed into a single breath. This does not mean intensity without rest. It means attention without distraction. It means treating each task, each conversation, each decision as worthy of full engagement. A life made of such moments becomes unified rather than scattered. Presence also protects the mind from self-inflicted torment. Regret chains the soul to what cannot be undone. Anxiety tortures the soul with what does not yet exist. But in the now, suffering often becomes simpler, more bearable. The problem in front of you is rarely as monstrous as the problem imagined. Marcus understood that clarity emerges when the mind is not entangled in temporal distortion. The present reduces fear to its true size. This discipline of presence reshapes identity. The self is no longer defined by past failures or future fantasies. It becomes defined by action in this exact moment. A person who lives in the present becomes unburdened by narratives of former mistakes. He becomes untempted by illusions of future greatness. He becomes architect of himself with each breath. Marcus sees identity as process, not possession. Presence sharpens this truth. In the modern world of 2025, presence is under siege. Distraction has become cultural currency. Devices fracture attention into fragments. Notifications claw at the mind. People live in perpetual anticipation of the next moment, the next message, the next stimulation. The result is psychic exhaustion. The individual becomes spectator of his own life, drifting through days without ever inhabiting them. Marcus's call for presence becomes rebellion against the fragmentation of consciousness. To be present is to reclaim sovereignty. It is to say no to the forces, internal and external, that seek to divide attention. Presence becomes act of defiance. It demands full ownership of one's time, one's thought, one's focus. Marcus urges himself to return again and again to the moment, even after drifting. The discipline is not perfection, but return. The mind will wander. Return. The mind will fear. Return. The mind will grieve. Return. Presence is persistence. Presence also transforms relationships. When one listens fully, without waiting to reply or judge, connection deepens. Compassion becomes more precise. Ego loses its grip. Marcus insists that when speaking with another person, one should give complete attention, as if nothing else in the universe existed. This is not exaggeration. It is ethical commitment. To give someone presence is to acknowledge their humanity. To withhold it is subtle cruelty. In solitude, presence sharpens self-understanding. When the noise of distraction is removed, deeper layers of thought, motivation, and fear come into view. Marcus writes that one must become friend to one's own mind. But friendship requires attention. Without presence, the inner world becomes estranged. The person loses access to intuition and wisdom. Presence restores the bridge. Another dimension of presence arises in physicality. The Stoics believed the body and mind must be aligned. When the body acts one way and the mind wanders elsewhere, fragmentation grows. Action becomes mechanical rather than intentional. Marcus demands full embodiment in every gesture. When walking, walk. When eating, eat. When speaking, speak. Simplicity becomes gateway to depth. A present life is not shallow, it is rooted. Presence also dissolves fear of the future. When one commits fully to the moment, future anxieties lose their oxygen. They cannot thrive in a mind anchored in now. Marcus insists that the future, when it arrives, will arrive as another present moment. If one can master this moment, one can master the next. This belief gives courage, it gives stability, it gives direction. But presence does not eliminate struggle, it reveals it. It forces the individual to face discomfort directly, rather than masking it with distraction. Marcus embraces this because struggle, when confronted consciously, becomes fuel for growth. Pain that is met rather than avoided becomes transformative. Presence turns adversity into teacher. At the same time, presence intensifies joy. Joy becomes sharper, richer, more immediate, not because circumstances improve, but because the individual actually experiences them. Joy cannot be felt in memory or anticipation. It exists only in the living moment. Marcus knows this intimately. Amid the pressures of empire, he still pauses to appreciate small textures of daily existence. He writes that life's beauty lies in transient details, a cup, a gesture, a breath. Presence magnifies beauty. As Marcus deepens his mastery of presence, a more profound realization begins to take form beneath his reflections. If life must be lived moment by moment, without attachment to past or future, then the self must learn to release everything that does not belong to the now. And from this release emerges the Stoic's final test, the discipline of letting go. Letting go is the final frontier Marcus Aurelius confronts, the discipline that demands not action, but release, not mastery, but surrender, not force, but freedom. All the previous insights, presence, virtue, cosmic order, acceptance of death, clarity of control, prepare the mind for this last demand. For the greatest weight the human being carries is not the world itself, but his refusal to release what the world has already taken from his hands. Letting go becomes the art of withdrawing attachment from what was never truly his to hold. Marcus sees that suffering often arises not from loss, but from resistance to loss. Things change, and the mind refuses. People drift away, and the mind clings. Plans collapse, and the mind protests. The world moves forward, and the mind remains anchored in a moment that no longer exists. Letting go is not resignation. It is the recognition that the world will not pause for our emotional attachment. To cling is to be dragged. To release is to walk. He writes that everything is borrowed from nature and must be returned on nature's terms. We possess nothing permanently, not our bodies, not our relationships, not our achievements, not our identities. We are stewards, not owners. To insist otherwise is to live in contradiction with reality. Marcus refuses contradiction. He demands lucidity, even when lucidity wounds. Letting go does not diminish love, it purifies it. Love that clings becomes possession. Love that releases becomes reverence. Marcus knows that to love another is to accept the fragility of their presence. To demand permanence is to demand the impossible. Letting go honors the natural rhythm of connection, allowing affection to grow without suffocation. When people leave, through choice, distance, or death, Stoic love releases them without bitterness. Grief remains, but resentment dissolves. Letting go of control becomes equally essential. Marcus repeatedly reminds himself that outcomes lie beyond his reach. He can act with integrity, but he cannot dictate results. Obsession with controlling outcomes fractures peace. The world will not bend to personal convenience. Letting go of control is not apathy, it is alignment. It is choosing to anchor the self in effort rather than outcome. Once effort is complete, the burden must be released. Holding on to fear of the future also corrupts the present. Fear grows from the imagination's attempt to control what has not yet arrived. Marcus counters this by returning to the moment again and again. The future, he writes, will arrive with the same capacities you possess now: clarity, courage, virtue. To fear the future is to doubt one's own strength. Letting go of fear is choosing trust in one's ability to respond when the future becomes present. Letting go of the past becomes equally necessary. The past steals life when the mind rehearses regret or nostalgia. Regret chains the soul to what cannot be altered. Nostalgia blinds the soul to what is unfolding now. Marcus rejects both. He views the past as dead landscape, useful for learning, dangerous for dwelling. Letting go of the past means withdrawing emotional energy from what no longer exists and reinvesting it in what does. The past becomes teacher, not prison. Letting go also applies to identity. The self is not static. It changes through experience, reflection, discipline. But many cling to a version of themselves long outgrown. Marcus refuses to freeze his identity in earlier forms. He allows himself to evolve, to shed habits, beliefs, and desires that no longer align with virtue. Letting go of identity becomes essential for growth. Without release, becoming remains impossible. Letting go requires courage because holding on feels safer. Attachment gives illusion of stability, but illusion is not safety. Marcus understands that true security lies in adaptability, not grip. The individual who clings becomes brittle. The one who releases becomes resilient. Flexibility is strength. Rigidity is fracture. In the world of 2025, letting go has become countercultural. Society encourages accumulation, achievements, possessions, experiences, validation. People are taught to cling to images of success, to curate identities, to preserve impressions. But clinging suffocates. It fills life with unnecessary weight. Marcus would see this as spiritual exhaustion, a life swollen with excess meaning, placed on things destined to vanish. Letting go becomes purification, the stripping away of all that is not essential. It reveals what truly matters: the integrity of one's actions, the clarity of one's mind, the depth of one's relationships, the courage of one's choices. Everything else is temporary decoration. Marcus advises himself to walk lightly, not because life is fragile, but because unnecessary burden weakens purpose. He also knows that letting go is not single act, but continuous practice. The mind will cling again. The heart will cling again. Desire will cling again. Each time, the Stoic gently but firmly releases attachment. Repetition becomes transformation. Gradually, the individual learns to move through the world without demanding that it remain unchanged. The world breathes, shifts, dissolves, renews. Letting go is learning to breathe with it. This discipline is not passive. It sharpens action. When one is no longer weighed down by fear of loss, one acts more boldly. When one is no longer chained to outcomes, one focuses more clearly. When one is no longer imprisoned by past or future, one responds more precisely to the moment. Letting go expands capacity for virtue because the mind becomes unencumbered. Marcus also recognizes that letting go reveals the final truth of Stoicism. Nothing external belongs to us, yet everything internal remains ours. No one can take our response, our character, our judgment, unless we surrender it. Letting go of externals strengthens grip on internals. It restores sovereignty where it belongs. As Marcus refines this discipline, another insight begins to surface. If letting go is ultimate expression of inner freedom, then beneath all Stoic practice lies a deeper purpose: to transform the self so completely that the world cannot shake it. To reach a state where virtue replaces fear, clarity replaces confusion, presence replaces distraction, freedom replaces attachment. And from that place emerges the final movement of Marcus's thought, the culmination of all inner labor, an inquiry into what it means to live a life fully aligned with nature, reason, and the deepest truths of the human spirit. Strength is never found in the world. It is found in the way we stand inside it. This is the final truth Marcus Aurelius leaves us with. After all the reflections on judgment, perspective, mortality, control, cosmic order, virtue, community, the inner citadel, negative visualization, and presence, one realization emerges with the force of a verdict. Peace is not something granted by circumstance. Peace is something forged within the self. Marcus never promises an easier life. He lived through plague, war, betrayal, and the crushing isolation of leadership. He never pretended suffering could be eliminated, nor did he chase a fantasy of permanent comfort. What he offers instead is a way to remain whole while the world fractures, a way to breathe steadily while chaos accelerates, a way to stay human in moments that tempt us to abandon ourselves. Stoicism becomes not a shield against life, but a stance toward life, unyielding, honest, awake. Stoicism does not harden the heart, it refines it. It removes excess fear, not tenderness. It removes illusion, not feeling. It removes dependence, not connection. Marcus teaches that depth does not come from fleeing the world, but from meeting it with clarity. Life becomes deeper when we stop resisting the truth of its volatility. Joy becomes richer when we stop demanding that it last. Suffering becomes lighter when we stop interpreting it as injustice. Everything becomes more vivid when we stop negotiating with reality and begin inhabiting it. True freedom, Marcus reveals, is internal. It is the freedom to choose our response when the world does not negotiate. It is the freedom to hold integrity when circumstances erode comfort. It is the freedom to stay present when the mind wants to run. It is the freedom to soften without collapsing and to stand without hardening. No empire can grant such freedom, and no disaster can take it away. This freedom is not dramatic. It does not announce itself. It grows quietly, breath by breath, choice by choice, in the way we interpret a moment, the way we speak to another, the way we guide our attention, the way we return to ourselves after drifting. It grows in the discipline of thought, the courage of action, the humility of service, the steadiness of presence. Freedom is the architecture of an examined inner life. Marcus stands as proof that power cannot protect the mind, but philosophy can shape it. His diary is the testament of a man who understood that the true battlefield is internal. Armies may surround him, but the real struggle is always against fear, illusion, and impulse. And the victory he seeks is not conquest, but lucidity. In a world that grows louder each year, a world fragmented by distraction, urgency, and emotional volatility, Marcus's voice cuts through like a blade. He does not promise a calmer world. He promises a steadier self. Calm does not come from reducing the weight of life, but from increasing the strength of the mind that carries it. His legacy is not a system of rules, but a way of standing, grounded, awake, deliberate. His question to us is simple but severe. Will you let the world dictate the state of your soul, or will you choose the stance from which you meet it? And when we finally understand him, when the architecture he built through 10 chapters settles into place, one truth becomes undeniable. Peace is not given. Peace is built. And it is built. Exactly where life happens. Here, now, in the quiet but decisive space between what the world does and how we choose to live inside it.